In this week's News Matters segment, I am excited to have Alison Uncles join us, who is the Vice President, PPF Media and Communications. Alison, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I have been wanting to chat with you for a few weeks now, ever since I had a chance to dive into The Lost Estate, How to Put the Local Back in Local News. This report just came out in February. So before we dive into the report and its findings, how did this report actually come to be?
That's a great question because the origin story is kind of interesting. Paul McNeil is a publisher of a local outlet in Charlottetown. And he also sits on the board of the Michener Foundation, Michener Ward Foundation. And the Micheners are kind of Canada's equivalent to the Pulitzers in the States. And that awards organization has been seeing over the years the kind of impact in real time of the disintegration of local news across the country. So they teamed up with the Rideau Hall Foundation, and the Rideau Hall Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit kind of charity that works to support Governor General work to fund a conference around local news. And they invited only entrepreneurs. So not journalists so much, although sometimes in local environments it's the same person, but people who are really interested in the business side to try to crack the nut of what do we need in Canada to support local news in general.
At the beginning of the report, there is a great overview in terms of the state of local news and how people perceive local news. I thought it was interesting that 77% of people surveyed say having a local news source is important to them. Can you talk about the state of local news today in Canada in terms of what's happening in local news? We hear a lot of stories of local news outlets that are shutting down, some new ones starting up. Where are we at today?
Well, we're at a little bit of a sad place, I have to say. There is some optimism at the end of this, but the stats are really dire. We quoted statistics from the Toronto Metropolitan University project that monitors local news outlets across the country, and they've been doing this since 2008, and they've recorded 526 closures across the country since then. Um, of course, lots have sprung up in their place, but many of those have died quickly. So the net number is kind of 340 communities across the country don't have a local news outlet, and they did in 2008 or before then. So the numbers are rocketing downwards, and it's super scary in terms of democracy because, as you say, people really want their local news outlet. They value it. And what we found was in this Ipsos poll that surveyed 1,000 people across the country in smaller communities, so 100,000 and less, was the trust that people have in local news is much higher than the trust that they have in national news or international news. These are outlets that they know, they're run by people that they see in the supermarket, and they're not as partisan as outlets that are more distant from them. So it's really, really important to maintain that ecosystem of trustworthy local news that delivers what people in smaller communities need.
It was fascinating to me just to dive into some of these stats, and certainly the mention in terms of within the report when you talk about what happened in 2023 with Meta's decision to ban Canadian news from Facebook and Instagram. That's certainly an area that I'm definitely more savvy about. I was curious, what type of impact did that have on local news, which of course continues today?
Well, it's been devastating. We quoted a statistic from the Media Ecosystem Laboratory that said that engagement for local news outlets in Canada has decreased 85% since that ban. And we talked about a case study of the River Valley Sun in New Brunswick, which is a tiny, tiny paper. But the story is really engaging in terms of they can't even, of course, access their archive. It's a super long-running small community newspaper, and the owner lives just across the border from Maine and has to drive across to Maine to access her newspaper's archives online. So engagement has fallen off a cliff, archives have disappeared. And of course, discoverability. These are small outlets that don't have massive budgets for marketing and advertising. And a lot of times the way you find them is via Facebook. So yeah, the last year and a bit has been really difficult for those places.
Yeah, just to echo your comments, it certainly has been devastating. And I think, if we dive into the report even further, there is a little bit of a sliver of some good news. There are some highlights, five case studies in
Mhm.
particular. I have heard of some of these local news organizations in the past, particularly Cabin Radio, which is in
Mm.
Yellowknife. And
Yeah.
I was kind of blown away to see, at a time when, of course, there's so much pressure, there's so many outside factors that are impacting local news, they've been able to get up to 1 million online views a month in Yellowknife, a city of around 20,000 people. I would love to hear a little bit more about stories like this and how perhaps they give you a bit of hope about people reimagining what a local news organization looks like in 2025.
Well, that's the really great news about this story is against the backdrop of really terrible headwinds that these outlets are having to face. You know, you mentioned Facebook, of course, advertising dollars going to Amazon as well, local businesses folding and not being able to support them. So they're really up against a lot of trouble. But we've found incredible stories of dedication and determination across the country. You know, this conference that was organized by the Rita Hall Foundation and the Michener Awards Foundation, which I attended last year in Charlottetown, just made you want to weep at every corner. Um, there were more than 60 entrepreneurs from across the country, and each one had a story like Cabin Radio. And I love the Cabin Radio story too. That's, as you say, a radio station in Yellowknife founded by a guy who moved to Canada from Britain for love. And the love part didn't work out in the end, but the radio station really has. And he's going head to head against the CDC there in a way that is really inspiring. During the wildfires a couple of years ago, he and his station were online. Um, 20 were broadcasting 24 hours a day, and that's really when they kind of made their mark there and won their listenership. We talked to the publisher and editor of the Haida Gwaii News, a new newspaper, very small in Haida Gwaii, that's distributed by bicycle and ferry and car. People come up to her in the street and give her checks, $200, $20, because they appreciate that this is so much work on her part in addition to her full-time job, which is not journalism. Um, but she feels so strongly that the community needs a newspaper, and it has to be print there because the connectivity issues are so dire. So, just almost heroism there in Haida Gwaii, and Cabin Radio, another example, and the local in Toronto, also a great example of a new business model really making it work. That's an organization that decided that they would go the nonprofit route, and they're being funded by a number of charities. But their whole ethos is that they try to go deeper on really meaningful democratic stories that mainstream media are no longer covering. You know, there are entire ridings in the city of Toronto, even, that are not covered well during an election. And so they do things like write profiles of the candidates and do long form features about election battles, as well as lots of other journalism, but that's kind of at the center, at their core. They're really determined to deliver the information that voters need to make educated decisions. Um, so yeah, I mean, I could honestly go on. This conference and these innovators across the country are amazing, and they're going to do it. We're going to get there, but they do that's the kind of middle part of the report. The end part of the report is Canada does need to do some things to help support this entrepreneurialism.
Absolutely. A couple of times you've mentioned the Charlottetown conference, and wanted to dive into what took place there. You did refer to a couple of examples of people who came, some of those local stories, but I also thought it was interesting to read about the role of government in terms of supporting local news, and in particular something that I hadn't really thought about. It was, and I'm going to quote from the report: "If we could just get their advertising, we wouldn't
Mm,
need subsidy programs." And,
mm.
this was like an aha moment for me when I was reading through this. Of course, this makes sense, right? If governments of all sizes could advertise in local news, that would be the support that these local news organizations would need versus subsidies. So, could you unpack that a little bit?
Yes, for sure. That's a really, I'm so glad you picked up on that point because I was very excited by it as well. And it did light a fire at the conference when it was mentioned on the stage that in the States, this is being done in a few states that and of course, in Ontario, the Ontario government last year decided to allocate 25% of its advertising spending to community newspapers. They were actually modeling that idea on something that had happened in Australia, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant from both angles. It helps the community newspaper, but it's also helping the Ontario government reach these communities that are sometimes difficult to reach. So their advertising dollars are being really well spent, and they're supporting, this democratic kind of ideal. So that was one idea that surfaced at the conference, um, that then we kind of investigated and researched and pulled out in our report. But the other one is also an advertising tax credit for local businesses. So local business would have would have the choice about where they might like to advertise. Do they want to advertise in Cabin Radio? Do they want to advertise in Haida Gwaii News? And if they choose a community newspaper, they would have a tax credit as a result. So it's leaving the decision making in terms of with the local business. But if they choose to advertise locally, they get there's an advantage for them rather than going out of habit to Facebook and Google.
All really smart ideas, and I think necessary for the future. Another thing in the report was this section on philanthropy and the role that philanthropy can play in terms of supporting local news, which, if I understand this correctly, in the US is actually quite common and prevalent. How does that fare to what's happening here in Canada?
Yeah. Yeah, philanthropy is another kind of exciting axis where we could see a lot of upside here. The States has an organization called Report for America that we got pretty excited about. They're nonpartisan, they're nonprofit, and they use philanthropic funding to run a program that is just incredibly innovative. They help local newsroom. They fund local reporters. So they will give a local newsroom, a reporter. They'll pay for 50% of the person's wage. Then they will ask the local newsroom to fundraise for 25%, and they'll help with that fundraising. So they teach the local newsroom how to fundraise, and then they ask the local newsroom to pay 25% of the wage themselves. And there's a whole learning program that's kind of wrapped in that too. So it's not just that you put a young reporter in a newsroom and just hope that they fare okay. They're really well supported. And the local newsroom is learning how in a sense to fund itself long term because this program will help it for a short term, and then they can use the funding muscles that they've acquired to go out and fundraise for themselves. So we've suggested that model for Canada, and that would really mean philanthropy stepping up to help fund it. But the other thing, I guess, to note around philanthropy in Canada is that there are 200 philanthropic local organizations across Canada, like the Toronto Community Foundation is one of them, and there's 199 others. And they really, I would say, in a way that is respectful, but and Toronto Foundation has led the way on this, but they really need to start thinking of their funding more broadly. That in lots of cases, they're funding a homelessness project or they're funding a morning breakfast program or that kind of thing in their community. But there's a connection, a really strong connection to that kind of work and journalism. They really do go hand in hand. And if the journalism isn't there to raise awareness about these problems that the community foundations are so invested in, then there's a critical piece missing. So if the local philanthropic community could start to recognize that they need journalism to further the causes that they're interested in, we could see us hopefully start to see some more funding heading into the direction of local news outlets.
It feels to me like this is a bit of a roller coaster in terms of this journey of local news and where we're at right now. Certainly, lots of highs and lots of lows. My last question for you is just the impact of what happens if we don't get this right. In the conclusion, in particular, I was reading a great paragraph kind of summarizing the situation that we are in, and the report writes, at stake is nothing short of the social and political health of communities across the country. Democracy, as is often said dies in darkness.
Mm.
What happens and how much time do we have to sort of restore things to the point where local news continues to be viable for these communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really scary. We asked in this poll communities who had lost an outlet what it meant to them. What was life after you lost that outlet? And they talked about things like not knowing what's going on in the hospital, not knowing what's going on at police, not knowing what's going on in the courts. They felt that their ties to the community were weakened. They even talked about empathy, kind of social empathy declining. They didn't care as much about each other because they didn't know each other. Um, so local news is that glue. It performs so many functions. It's the togetherness of the community, but it's also the accountability piece of making sure that the people governing you are behaving correctly and know that there's someone watching. There are studies, lots of studies in the States, fewer of them in Canada, but around the idea that small communities even do better financially when there's local news there because that sense of watchdog does make people behave more fiscally responsibly. So that's a long answer to a really beautiful question. I love the quote that you read. Um, Without local news, we are in terrible, terrible trouble, democratically and socially. Um, and I think that I'm starting to feel a groundswell. This report came at just a moment where, of course, we're feeling more of a sense of national pride around possible tariffs coming soon. But also the idea that local news has finally got on the radar nationally. And, this conference was one piece of it. This report was another piece. But I'm starting to hear everywhere I go, and this podcast is a piece of that in terms of people being interested in exploring the question of what happens when we don't have it. And the answer is big, big trouble, big trouble. So I'm hoping that some of these ideas, government ideas, philanthropic ideas, ideas for entrepreneurs, will plant seeds that will really grow and start to feed this a really important ecosystem.
Well said, Allison. And thank you so much for joining me today. For people who want to read the report, where is the best place for them to go?
ppforum.ca. Thank you for the plug.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it's a really easy, concise read for people who want to understand this subject a little more deeply. And really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the great questions.